Silver futures gained $7 per ounce in 4 minutes, not because of mining news or monetary policy, because Canada chose China over America, and 340,000 ounces of monthly silver demand just entered the North American market. The implications were only beginning. The announcement came at 11:23 a.m. Eastern Time on January 21st, delivered from the World Economic Forum stage in Davos. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney received a standing ovation as he declared that Canada would immediately reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 15%, effective February 1st. The applause lasted 47 seconds. By the time it ended, the global automotive industry had fundamentally changed, and America found itself facing economic isolation from its closest ally. What the audience heard was a trade announcement. What they witnessed was the fracturing of North American economic integration that had defined continental commerce for 3 decades. The USMCA trade agreement, painstakingly negotiated and signed just years earlier, was being effectively nullified by Canadian unilateral action. The economic architecture of the continent was collapsing in real time. The preparatory work had been conducted in absolute secrecy. 3 months earlier, a series of private meetings in Shanghai had established the framework for what would become the most significant trade realignment in North American history. Chinese automotive executives, Canadian trade officials, and banking representatives had worked through the technical details of tariff elimination, supply chain integration, and currency arrangements. The meetings were deliberately kept off diplomatic schedules to avoid American intelligence detection. Canadian business leaders who had attended those Shanghai meetings understood they were witnessing history. BYD's commitment to invest an additional $4.2 billion in Canadian manufacturing was contingent on tariff elimination. NIO's promise to establish a North American headquarters in Toronto required preferential trade status. The Chinese automotive industry wasn't just seeking market access, it was offering to rebuild Canadian manufacturing around Chinese technological leadership. The numbers told a story of strategic reorientation that went far beyond automotive trade. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers had invested $8.7 billion in Canadian production facilities over the past 18 months. BYD's Montreal plant employed 12,000 workers. NIO's facility in Hamilton had created 8,000 jobs. Xpeng's research center in Vancouver had become the largest private employer in the province. Canada wasn't just reducing tariffs, it was choosing China over America as its primary economic partner. But the real significance wasn't visible in the diplomatic language or trade statistics. It was hidden in the technical specifications that defined modern electric vehicles. Every Chinese EV entering the Canadian market required an average of 1.3 ounces of silver for battery management systems, electrical contacts, and charging infrastructure. At current production projections, the tariff reduction would increase North American silver consumption by 340,000 ounces monthly. The silver market was about to experience demand shock. The silver requirement breakdown revealed the technological sophistication of Chinese electric vehicle design. Battery management systems alone consumed 0.4 ounces per vehicle through complex circuitry that monitored temperature, voltage, and charge distribution. High current electrical contacts required an additional 0.3 ounces of pure silver to ensure reliable performance under extreme conditions. Motor control systems demanded another 0.2 ounces for switch contacts, but the largest silver consumption came from charging infrastructure. Each fast charging station required 45 ounces of silver for electrical contacts, transformers, and power management systems. Chinese automotive manufacturers had committed to installing 15,000 charging stations across Canada within 18 months. The infrastructure expansion alone would consume 675,000 ounces of silver before a single vehicle crossed the border. The timing of Carney's announcement revealed sophisticated coordination between Ottawa and Beijing. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng had spoken at Davos just hours earlier, outlining China's Arctic Silk Road initiative that would connect Chinese manufacturing to North American markets through Canadian ports. The two speeches weren't separate events, they were coordinated elements of a comprehensive strategy to isolate America economically while securing Chinese access to critical resources. The immediate market response was swift and devastating for American interests. Tesla stock fell 12% in pre-market trading as investors calculated the competitive implications. Ford's share price collapsed 8%. General Motors dropped 15%. The entire American automotive sector was discovering that trade wars had consequences, and those consequences were now materializing in the form of Chinese competition enabled by Canadian cooperation. But the silver market was experiencing the opposite dynamic. Futures contracts spiked $7 per ounce within minutes of Carney's speech. Physical demand from Chinese manufacturers preparing for expanded North American production was already straining supply chains. The London Bullion Market Association reported inventory drawdowns exceeding daily averages by 300%. Smart money was positioning for what looked like a sustained silver supply crisis. The geopolitical implications extended far beyond trade policy into the fundamental question of alliance relationships. For 70 years, America had assumed that geographic proximity guaranteed Canadian loyalty. The assumption was proving false. When forced to choose between American political pressure and Chinese economic opportunity, Canada was choosing economic opportunity. Geography was proving less important than prosperity. The strategic calculation in Ottawa had been months in the making. Trump's tariff threats against European allies over Greenland had demonstrated that American protection came with increasingly unreasonable demands. Canadian intelligence assessments suggested that American trade policy was becoming unpredictably aggressive, potentially targeting Canadian resources if political circumstances required convenient scapegoats. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly had conducted discreet consultations with 12 allied nations before Carney's announcement. The responses were uniformly supportive. Australia was considering similar arrangements with Chinese solar manufacturers. New Zealand was evaluating Chinese battery technology partnerships. Even traditional American allies were concluding that economic diversification was essential for national survival. European leaders watching from Davos understood the implications immediately. If Canada would abandon American trade preferences for Chinese alternatives, then American alliance commitments were worth less than previously calculated. Emmanuel Macron was overheard telling advisers that the American century is ending faster than we anticipated. The Western alliance was fragmenting not through military defeat, but through economic reality. The technical details of the Canada-China agreement revealed the depth of economic integration that had developed outside American awareness. Chinese manufacturers would receive preferential access to Canadian lithium deposits in Quebec. Canadian rare earth processing facilities would prioritize Chinese customers. Most significantly, Chinese electric vehicle production would qualify for Canadian content requirements under various international trade agreements. The silver implications were staggering. Chinese EV manufacturers had designed their North American models to be silver-intensive rather than silver-efficient. Unlike American manufacturers who were trying to minimize silver usage due to cost concerns, Chinese companies were maximizing silver integration to ensure superior electrical performance. Every vehicle entering the Canadian market would consume 40% more silver than equivalent American models. Banking relationships were adapting faster than government policies. The Bank of Montreal announced it would provide financing for Chinese EV purchases at preferential rates. TD Bank established dedicated lending facilities for Chinese automotive investments. Royal Bank of Canada created special programs for silver procurement by Chinese manufacturers. The Canadian banking sector was positioning itself as the financial intermediary for expanded Chinese North American trade. The environmental movement found itself in an impossible position. Canadian climate activists had spent years advocating for electric vehicle adoption to reduce carbon emissions. Now the most affordable EVs were Chinese models that required massive silver inputs. Environmental protection was becoming dependent on increased mining extraction. American intelligence agencies were reportedly analyzing the silver supply chain implications of expanded Chinese EV penetration into North America. Every Chinese vehicle sold in Canada created ongoing dependency relationships that extended beyond simple commerce. Battery management systems required regular software updates controlled by Chinese manufacturers. Charging infrastructure needed ongoing maintenance by Chinese technicians. The vehicles were becoming platforms for technological dependence. The labor implications were equally complex. Canadian auto workers initially celebrated the job creation from Chinese investments, but the working conditions and wage structures at Chinese-owned facilities were different from traditional North American automotive plants. Union organizers were discovering that Chinese management practices prioritized efficiency over worker protections. The job creation came with cultural and economic costs that weren't immediately apparent. Mining companies were among the clear winners in the new arrangement. Barrick Gold's Canadian silver operations received priority purchase agreements from Chinese manufacturers. First Quantum's silver production was contracted for the next 5 years at premium prices. Agnico Eagle's Quebec facilities expanded operations to meet increasing demand. The mining sector was experiencing unprecedented growth driven by Chinese industrial requirements. But the real innovation was in financial arrangements. Chinese manufacturers weren't paying for silver in dollars. They were offering yuan-denominated contracts with currency hedging provided by Chinese banks. The transactions were effectively creating parallel trade relationships that bypassed American monetary control. Silver was becoming the bridge between Chinese manufacturing and North American resources. The technological implications extended beyond electric vehicles into the broader relationship between innovation and resource access. Chinese companies were demonstrating that they could develop superior battery technology by using more silver-intensive designs rather than silver-efficient alternatives. American manufacturers had been constrained by silver costs. Chinese manufacturers were constrained only by silver availability. Agricultural trade was experiencing unexpected spillover effects. Chinese companies purchasing Canadian silver were offering commodity exchanges that included agricultural products, canola oil for silver, wheat for battery metals, lumber for rare earths. The transactions were creating integrated supply relationships that reduced Chinese dependence on American agricultural exports. The insurance industry was struggling to assess risks in the new trading environment. Lloyd's of London suspended coverage for American automotive companies operating in Canada pending geopolitical risk assessment. Other major insurers followed suit, effectively declaring that the traditional North American market was too unstable for conventional risk management. Currency markets were reflecting the deeper implications of trade realignment. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the US dollar for the first time in 18 months as investors bet on increased Chinese investment. But more significantly, yuan-denominated trade was increasing as a percentage of total Canadian-Chinese commerce. The dollar's role as intermediary currency was being systematically reduced. Central banks worldwide were watching the Canada-China arrangement as a template for post-American trade relationships. The Bank of England increased its silver reserves by 25% following the announcement. The Swiss National Bank authorized emergency silver purchases. Even allied central banks were hedging against the possibility that American economic dominance was ending. The automotive supply chain was reorganizing around the new reality with remarkable speed. Magna International, Canada's largest automotive supplier, announced it would prioritize Chinese customers over American ones. Linamar Corporation established dedicated production lines for Chinese-designed components. The entire Canadian automotive ecosystem was reorienting toward Asian rather than American markets. Border infrastructure was being rapidly expanded to accommodate increased Chinese trade. The Port of Vancouver announced $2.3 billion in expansion projects specifically designed for Chinese automotive imports. CN Rail and Canadian Pacific were establishing dedicated freight services. Educational institutions were adapting to the new economic reality. The University of Toronto announced a $400 million Chinese-funded research center focused on battery technology. McGill University established dedicated programs for Chinese automotive engineering. The energy sector was experiencing its own transformation. Chinese EV manufacturers required massive amounts of electricity for their Canadian production facilities. Quebec's hydroelectric system was being expanded specifically to serve Chinese industrial requirements. The energy grid was being restructured around Chinese rather than American demand patterns. International law experts were debating whether Canada's unilateral trade action violated WTO principles or USMCA commitments, but the legal questions were becoming irrelevant as economic facts created new realities. When survival was at stake, legal obligations became secondary to economic opportunities. The environmental costs were becoming apparent as silver mining expanded to meet Chinese demand. Indigenous communities in northern Quebec reported increased mining activity near traditional territories. Environmental groups documented habitat disruption from new silver extraction operations. The green energy transition was creating environmental costs that weren't visible in climate calculations. American response options were limited and unattractive. Retaliatory tariffs would hurt American consumers more than Canadian producers. Economic sanctions would drive Canada further into Chinese embrace. Military pressure was unthinkable against a neighbor and ally. America was discovering that economic coercion worked better when you had alternatives to offer. The White House Situation Room meeting convened at 3:17 p.m. Eastern Time, just hours after Carney's announcement. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen presented economic modeling that demonstrated the futility of traditional American responses. Tariffs on Canadian goods would increase American manufacturing costs by $47 billion annually, while doing nothing to prevent Chinese automotive penetration. The Pentagon's classified assessment was even more sobering. Military intervention to protect American economic interests was theoretically possible but practically catastrophic. Any action against Canada would instantly destroy American credibility with every remaining ally. NATO would fragment. American global leadership would end not through gradual decline, but through immediate isolation. The Federal Reserve was conducting emergency assessments of currency stability implications. If major trading partners began settling transactions in yuan rather than dollars, the demand for dollar-denominated assets would decline systematically. Chinese automotive partnerships were creating dollar-independent trade relationships that could eventually undermine American monetary authority. The Mexican government was quietly evaluating its own options as the USMCA framework collapsed. If Canada could abandon North American trade integration for Chinese alternatives, perhaps Mexico could explore similar opportunities. The trilateral trade relationship that had defined North American commerce was becoming a bilateral American isolation. Private equity firms were establishing funds specifically focused on Chinese-Canadian joint ventures. Apollo Global Management announced a $5 billion fund for Asian North American integration projects. The financial industry was positioning itself for a post-American North American economy. Technology transfer was accelerating as Chinese companies gained access to Canadian research institutions. Battery chemistry advances developed in Canadian universities were being shared with Chinese manufacturers. The knowledge economy was being redirected toward Asian rather than American applications. Consumer behavior was adapting to the new marketplace faster than policymakers anticipated. Canadian consumers were discovering that Chinese EVs offered better value propositions than American alternatives. The vehicles were less expensive, more feature-rich, and increasingly sophisticated. Market preferences were driving political realignment rather than following it. The defense implications were gradually becoming apparent to American strategic planners. If Chinese companies controlled significant portions of North American automotive production, they would also control transportation infrastructure in any future conflict. Economic dependence was creating military vulnerability that traditional security analysis hadn't anticipated. Financial markets were beginning to price in scenarios where North American economic integration was permanently fractured. Canadian banks were establishing yuan clearing relationships. Chinese banks were opening North American subsidiaries. The financial infrastructure was being rebuilt around Asian rather than American relationships. As January 21st drew to a close, the Canada-China Electric Vehicle Agreement was revealing itself to be much more than a trade deal. It was the visible symbol of a comprehensive realignment that was redistributing global economic relationships. America was becoming isolated not through military defeat or diplomatic failure, but through economic irrelevance. The real-time market adjustments were reflecting fundamental changes in global risk assessment. Credit default swaps on American municipal bonds increased 15% as investors calculated the implications of reduced tax revenue from declining automotive manufacturing. Canadian government bonds strengthened as markets priced and increased Chinese investment flows. Currency trading rooms were implementing new hedging strategies that assumed continued dollar weakness against Asian currencies. The Bank of Canada's foreign exchange reserves were being restructured to include increased yuan holdings. Even central banks were positioning for economic relationships that reduced dollar dependency. Corporate boardrooms were conducting strategic reviews that challenged decades of assumptions about North American market integration. Supply chains that had been optimized for continental efficiency were being redesigned around national rather than regional considerations. The economies of scale that had justified North American integration were being replaced by bilateral rather than multilateral relationships. Academic institutions were receiving funding for research programs that would systematically redirect technological development toward Chinese rather than American applications. The University of British Columbia announced a $300 million Chinese-funded institute for battery chemistry research. The knowledge economy was being reoriented around different technological priorities. The silver market closed at $121 per ounce, reflecting not just increased industrial demand, but the breakdown of the economic assumptions that had governed global trade for generations. Smart money was betting that resource control would matter more than military power in determining future prosperity. The question was no longer whether America could maintain its economic dominance. The question was whether any recognizable form of American influence would survive the systematic replacement of American relationships with Chinese alternatives. And increasingly, the evidence suggested that influence, like silver, belonged to whoever could offer the best terms for future cooperation. Silver futures gained $7 per ounce in 4 minutes, not because of mining news or monetary policy, because Canada chose China over America, and 340,000 ounces of monthly silver demand just entered the North American market. The implications were only beginning.